Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator, the COVID-free masturbator. I'm not even checking my temperature now. I'm so free of COVID at the moment that I didn't get it, but you know, there's always a next time, and I've survived this latest exposure to this awful disease. We got nothing. We got exciting. I guess I was going to say we have nothing exciting except the normal thing that we do on this show, which is just masturbate about books. And we're going to talk about a writer who I have a long kind of history with in my own personal history, which is Bruno Schulz. I'm going to put a link below to a piece I just wrote at the Spectator, a UK Spectator, which wasn't working the last couple of days, but that seems like their website's going a little crazy because of the UK climate or something. But anyway, it should be working eventually. And I wrote a piece basically about Bruno Schulz and this really excellent new book, really enjoyable. I don't even want to give it critical praise like excellent or must be read sort of stuff, but just enjoyable, bathtub worthy. This is the type of history of literature which you can take in the bathtub. By Benjamin Balint. We talked a bit about his book on Kafka's literary estate, the legal and international legal battles over Kafka's literary estate, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed a great deal, and it made me want to read this book and review it, and it allowed me to go back and read a writer I really admire named Bruno Schulz. You may or may not know about him. Anyway, my personal experience with Bruno Schulz would be way back I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I don't have the copies anymore, but Philip Roth edited this really cool Penguin series with like really neat. This is when trade paperbacks started to actually look nice, and he traded a series called Writers from the Other Europe. And Philip Roth got all these people translated or used old translations and brought them out in these nice, handsome Penguin editions in the U.S. and then England. And Milan Kundera, his reputation in the West kind of started there because they published a couple of his early books there. Before Unbearable Lightness of Being, I believe, and a number of other writers. But the writer who really knocked me out, much more than Kundera, actually, because I read some of those early Kunderas, was the great Bruno Schulz. One of the early books in that series was called The Street of Crocodiles. It was published, for dates and stuff, look below because I forget. It was published sometime in the world. And it's a very thin, magical, beautifully written, really lush, poetic, gorgeous, funny, philosophical novel, or short series of stories that kind of lend themselves to a novel atmosphere. You feel like you're in part of this world. And I loved it. It stuck in my head for years. I read the sequel, which I like a lot, Sanatorium Under the Sign of an Hourglass. It's a little overly complex for me. It's a little less beautiful in a way, less immediate. It's a little more of a thicker veneer to it than the original Street of Crocodiles. So it stuck with me, and when I saw this book coming out, it gave me a chance to go back and read him. I had gotten rid of my old editions because I bought this many years ago, which is the complete Bruno Schulz. That's all the fiction he produced in his lifetime. Fairly short, tragic lifetime. We'll talk about briefly. And he had the two novels, and maybe there's a few fragments here and there. And then I also have a book of his letters, which I picked up and read. Some of his letters are filled with fictional passages. He loved to make up stories. So that's what got me back to him. So the new book by Balint is talking about this same thing with the Kafkas, how this writer who died became a subject for all these legal squabbles over where his work should go. So he was born in a place, and I have to look this up every single time because I can't pronounce it, Drohobych in Galicia, okay, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at one point. I have to confess, whenever I hear the term Austro-Hungarian Empire or Habsburg Empire, my whole mind just goes into dizzy. I have no idea what the hell that means. It's like Prussia. The name Prussia comes to me every once in a while. As soon as I see like, where the hell is Prussia? And I've never been rigorous enough to go back and actually sort out these historical moments. My friend Avram Davidson, when I was young particularly, he used to get so mad at me when he would say something like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I'd say, what the hell is that? And he would just get mad at me. I just remember Avram getting upset. So anyway, I don't know what the hell those are, except that it's this kind of conjunction of all these different cultures, like parts of Yugoslavia, all these different languages and cultures. And he was raised really as a Polish. His Polish language was his primary language. His family was Jewish, but they didn't really practice Judaism, and they weren't very religious, and he had very ambivalent feelings towards religion in general. And now it's part of what's known. It's now part of what's known as Ukraine. So all these different, after his death, and he became sort of famous. He became sort of famous anyway, particularly in Poland, where his work, because in Polish, is, I'm sure it's incredibly beautiful. It's beautiful in translation. And he's kind of become a figure, like one of the main, some of the fathers of Polish modernism, I guess, one of the more important progenitors. I shouldn't say father, I know, but the precursors of Polish modernism. And so there's all these different people who start to argue about who he belongs to. And this wonderful book it's focused, like the Kafka book, around Kafka's literary estate and who owned it, around the discovery. After Schulz becomes sort of famous, and in the West he becomes famous because of the Philip Roth books, or slightly famous. In the 2001 or so, in his town, that town I just told you, which I can't pronounce, when the Nazis occupied, it was occupied by this horrible group of Gestapo agents, and a man whose name will be in the piece, who was just a monster. And like lots of monsters, he liked to show how cultured he was and how literary he was and artistic, and he appreciated art. So he used to steal it whenever he could steal some. And he took Bruno Schulz under his wing because Bruno Schulz was probably the most famous person in the area, as both an artist, because Schulz started off painting and drawing, self-taught, completely self-taught, very unusual, very beautiful, strange work. I think I want to show you one example of his work. His drawings look a little bit like, remind me a little bit of Mervyn Peake, with all the shadows and the kind of grotesque faces and the darkness and the dark ambiance of the Peake's sketches, and a fantastic surreal quality. So this horrible Gestapo agent took him under his wing and would give him jobs. And at one point he hired him. Well, didn't hire. He probably just said, "You do this or I'll kill you." He had him paint the walls of his children's nursery, and Schulz did some sort of magical fairy. He loved fairy tales and magical stories, so he did all that work. And this paint was painted over, or they turned into a cupboard or something by subsequent owners. And in 2001, they found this mural. I'll make this as short as I can. And then there became this battle over who owned the mural, and Israel, in that time, is really trying to recover him as a victim of not just as a Jewish writer, but as a victim of the Holocaust, and they want to bring his work to Israel and put it in the museum. So they actually sent agents, Israeli agents, in the middle of the night. They actually take this wall off and take it to Israel. And then there's the subsequent arguments about who it belongs to and who Bruno Schulz belongs to: Poland, Ukraine, or Israel. And that's the heart of the story and the interest of the story as far as just reading that book. But the book is mainly a biography of this Bruno Schulz, this fascinating, kind of lonely man who taught himself art and work and had lots of peculiar qualities that they go into in the book. He was kind of had a masochistic streak in him. He liked the idea of beautiful women hurting him, walking on him in high heels and stuff like that, which is neither here nor there. But I guess if you're going to be anything, you might as well be a masochist in this world rather than actually do hurt other people. But so that was his weird thing, and his students even sort of knew about it. They seemed to know about it, and they remembered him as this kind of strange, kind of twisted up guy, kind of uncomfortable man who loved to tell them fairy stories and make up fairy stories in class. And I don't want to say too much more about the book. The book's really worth taking into the bathtub. But for now, let's just talk a little bit about this wonderful book, Street of Crocodiles, or, again, I've got it in the collected Bruno Schulz. Street of Crocodiles was originally published in Polish as Cinnamon Shops. And if you hear that, by the way, you hear that kind of roar. I've had to film this 2 or 3 times. I have my air filter on because it's allergy season, and I start weeping, and it's not just because the book is beautiful or Bruno Schulz's life is so sad. I don't think I finished. He died during one of the many violence against Jewish people in this town, led by the Gestapo, who went out just shooting people for fun and have a laugh. And he was murdered for no reason whatsoever, along with lots of other people. Anyways, clear mountain water, clear a cruel light a day, no pixels, no drinking. So I don't know. I won't say much more. I've said everything I wanted to say really in the place below. And of course, as usual, the masturbator didn't really do a good job of marking his space because I did this thing so many times. I had to do this twice before. I did this. This is my third filming of this, and my eyes kept tearing up. So I had to use the fan. I'm going to read a little passage just to give you a taste of Bruno Schulz about this young boy traveling through this city filled with cultures and weird items for sale from all over the world, and the different languages running around, and all this mix of cultures and languages. And he was raised in this home where his parents were tailors, and he was surrounded by tailors' dummies, and he had these kind of very powerful women in his life, his mother and one of the maids and a sister who just bossed him around constantly. And it's all told from this boy's point of view, this child's point of view. It reminds me a little bit of Bradbury, much richer, more philosophical texture to the language. And then a little bit, well, his drawings remind me a bit of Peake. His fiction actually reminds me a little of Marc Chagall. You know, those magical horses flying across the moon and so forth. It really reminds me of him. Anyway, I'm just going to give you one passage of the boy walking through these shops. Lent wings by my desire to visit the cinnamon shops, I turned into a street I knew and ran rather than walked, anxious not to lose my way. I passed 3 or 4 streets, but still there was no sign of the turning I wanted. What is more, the appearance of the street was different from what I had expected, nor was there any sign of the shops. I was in a street of houses with no doors, and of which the tightly shut windows were blind from reflected moonlight. On the other side of those houses, I thought, must run the street from which they were accessible. I was walking faster now, rather disturbed, beginning to give up the idea of visiting the cinnamon shops. All I wanted now was to get out of there quickly, into some part of the city I knew better. I reached the end of the street, unsure where it would lead me. I found myself in a broad, sparsely built avenue, very long and straight. I felt on me the breath of a wide open space. Close to the pavement, or in the midst of their gardens, picturesque villas stood there, the private houses of the rich. In the gaps between them were parks and walls of orchards. The whole area looked like Lesnianska Street in its lower and rarely visited part. The moonlight filtered through 1,000 feathery clouds like silver scales on the sky. It was pale and bright as daylight. Only the parks and gardens stood black in that silvery landscape. It is every paragraph of Street of Crocodiles is like that almost. It's just magical, beautifully written, visual, very much an artist's vision of the world through language, and just a lovely book. So anyway, it's worth reading the wonderful ballad book, but even despite his history, one of the things I find most interesting about great writers is that no matter what their lives were like, how horrible or how wonderful they were, the books themselves they produce is what you best get from them, what you best enjoy about them. They enjoyed what they produced, and he wrote some beautiful work. Okay, happy bathing. We'll do another one of these pretty quick now. Bye.